This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The woman who looks fine. I want to start with something unsettling because it's true and because it's rarely said out loud. The most dangerous moment in a woman's life is not when everything is falling apart. It's when everything looks fine. No alarms, no visible cracks, no one rushing in to save her. Just a woman standing in the middle of her life, fully functioning, deeply tired, and unable to explain why she feels so far away from herself. I am that woman. I don't look broken. I don't sound desperate. I don't cancel plans or cry in public or fall behind on responsibilities. I show up. I answer emails. I remember birthdays. I keep things running. If you passed me in a grocery store or sat next to me at work, you would never think something is wrong here. That's the problem, because nothing is wrong enough to justify the emptiness I carry, and when pain has no obvious cause, it turns inward. It becomes quiet, polite, invisible. I wake up every morning and move through my routines like someone who knows the steps by heart. Coffee, shower, clothes, work, conversations, smiles placed carefully where they belong. From the outside, my life has structure. From the inside, it has very little sensation. I am not unhappy. I am not happy. I am neutral, and neutrality, over time, can hollow a woman out. I remember driving alone one evening, the sky already dark, the road familiar enough that my body knew it without thought. The radio was on, but I couldn't tell you what was playing. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. My face was calm, and suddenly, without warning, a thought rose up so clearly it felt like it came from somewhere else. When was the last time I actually felt alive? Not productive, not needed, not admired for holding everything together. Alive? That question hit harder than any crisis ever could, because there was no clear answer. If you're listening to this and something in your chest just tightened, stay with me. This isn't a story about collapse. It's a story about erosion. And erosion is harder to notice because it happens slowly, quietly, over years of being fine. I've been called strong more times than I can count, responsible, reliable, independent. I've accepted those labels like medals, even when they felt heavy on my shoulders. Strength became my identity, and identities are hard to question when they're rewarded. When you are the woman who always handles things, people stop asking how you're doing, not because they don't care, but because your competence reassures them. You look like someone who doesn't need help, so you become someone who doesn't receive it. Over time, I learned how to regulate my emotions so well that I barely felt them at all. I learned which parts of myself were acceptable and which ones were inconvenient. I learned how to lower my expectations just enough to avoid disappointment, and how to call that maturity. But maturity isn't numbness, and stability isn't the absence of feeling. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people while feeling unseen. Not misunderstood, unseen, because there's nothing obvious to misunderstand. You're pleasant, capable, easy to be around. You don't demand much. You don't take up space. And the world rewards women who don't take up space. I wasn't living in pain. I was living in suspension, like my life was on pause, but no one had told me when it would resume. I kept thinking, this must be it. This must be what adulthood feels like. You do what you're supposed to do, and the rest is just quiet. But deep down, there was a restlessness I couldn't name. Not loud enough to call a crisis, just persistent enough to wear me down. I wasn't burned out. I wasn't depressed. I wasn't falling apart. I was functioning without meaning. And that's harder to admit than suffering, because suffering gives you a reason to change. Functioning keeps you trapped. I think there are thousands, maybe millions of women like me, women who are not in obvious pain, but who are slowly disappearing from their own lives. Women who are doing what's required of them, but have forgotten what they desire. Women who don't feel broken, yet feel strangely absent. We don't talk about this stage of life very much. There's no dramatic language for it, no urgent headlines. It doesn't sell well, because it doesn't look like tragedy, but it is a quiet loss. A loss of curiosity, a loss of inner movement, a loss of connection to the woman you used to be before everything became about being okay. I didn't need motivation. I didn't need someone to tell me to be grateful or push harder or think more positively. I had already mastered endurance. What I lacked wasn't strength, it was permission. Permission to admit that fine was no longer enough. There is a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp, when a woman realizes she has been surviving on autopilot. When she understands that her life is technically working, but internally disconnected. When she senses that if she keeps going this way, years will pass and she won't recognize herself anymore. That moment doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a quiet ache, a question you can't unhear, a sense that something essential has been postponed for too long. That moment is where this story begins. And if you're still listening, it's probably because some part of you recognizes yourself here, not in a dramatic way, in a subtle, unsettling way. Before we go any further, let me say this clearly. This channel is not about fixing yourself. It's not about becoming a better version or pushing through or performing healing. It's about honesty. It's about naming the places where you went quiet to survive and asking gently, bravely, what it would mean to come back to yourself. If this speaks to you, if you feel seen rather than instructed, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, not for motivation, not for noise, but for thoughtful, honest conversations that respect the complexity of women in the middle of their lives. Subscribing helps this space continue, and it allows these stories to reach women who don't yet have language for what they're feeling. Because you're not broken, you're not failing, and you're not alone in this quiet place. This is only the beginning. What I mean when I say soul, when I say the word soul, I'm not talking about something mystical or distant. I'm not speaking in religious shorthand or poetic abstraction. I'm talking about the most practical, lived-in part of me, the part that wakes up before my body does and stays awake long after the lights are off. My soul is not what I show, it's what I carry. It's the inner atmosphere I move through my life with. The tone beneath my thoughts, the emotional weather system that shapes how I experience ordinary moments. My soul is the place where meaning either gathers or quietly drains away. For a long time, I misunderstood this. I thought the soul was something you addressed only when things were falling apart, when grief was loud, when fear was obvious, when life had cracked open. But the truth is, the soul is most affected not by what breaks us suddenly, but by what we slowly learn to live with. The soul is shaped by repetition, by the conversations I never finished, by the feelings I learned to minimize, by the parts of myself I packed away because they didn't fit the life I was building. I learned how to function early, how to stay composed, how to keep moving forward without asking too many questions. And that ability served me well for a while. It helped me survive. It helped me adapt. It helped me build a life that looked stable from the outside. But survival has a cost. The soul doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits. It absorbs. It keeps records. The mind eventually forgets. And one day, without drama, it begins to feel heavy, not because something new has happened, but because too much old weight is still there. My soul holds my emotional memory, not just what happened, but how it felt to be me when it happened. It remembers the tone of rooms, the silence after certain words, the feeling of shrinking to keep peace. It remembers what I needed and didn't receive, and what I learned to stop expecting. There are rooms inside me I stopped visiting years ago, not because they were destroyed, but because I learned to live without opening those doors. I told myself I'd come back to them later, when things slowed down, when I had more time, when life felt safer. But later never came, and safety became something I defined as not making things worse. That's how many women lose contact with their soul, not through catastrophe, but through caution. I became careful, emotionally efficient. I stopped asking myself how I felt and started asking what was required. And over time, that question replaced everything else. What's needed here? What's appropriate? What keeps things smooth? Those are not bad questions, but they are incomplete ones. And when they become the only questions, the soul begins to thin out. The soul needs space. Not space to perform, or improve, or become impressive, but space to register experience, to feel without being edited, to respond honestly, without consequence management. I didn't give myself that space. I didn't even know I was allowed to. I told myself I was mature, that I'd grown past needing to feel deeply, that intensity was for younger women or messier lives. I equated emotional restraint with wisdom and silence with strength. But restraint isn't the same as healing. What I had mastered was suppression. And suppression is quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't interrupt your calendar. It lets you keep going, just with less color, less depth, less internal movement. You don't feel sad. You don't feel joyful. You feel contained. Contained emotions don't disappear. They harden. That's when the soul starts to ache in subtle ways. Not enough to send you to bed for days, just enough to make mornings heavier than they should be, enough to make you sigh without knowing why, enough to make even good moments feel oddly distant. I started noticing it in the smallest places, in how quickly I moved through my day as if slowing down might invite something I didn't have language for. In how I filled quiet moments with noise, not because I enjoyed it, but because silence felt uncomfortable. In how I avoided certain memories, not because they were painful, but because they stirred something I didn't want to disturb. My soul wasn't asking for answers. It was asking for attention. The problem is, attention requires honesty. And honesty can feel dangerous when you've built a life around being steady. I had learned how to manage myself so well that I didn't realize I was living with emotional arthritis. Everything still worked, but nothing moved freely anymore. I could bend, but with stiffness. I could feel, but only within narrow ranges. I wasn't disconnected from reality. I was disconnected from myself. And here's the part that surprised me. I wasn't unhappy about it. I had adapted. I had adjusted my expectations. I had lowered my internal volume enough that the absence of feeling didn't register as loss until it did. The soul doesn't demand attention all at once. It whispers first. Through restlessness, through fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, through the sense that life is happening but not fully landing. When I finally started paying attention, I realized something important. My soul didn't need to be repaired. It needed to be re-inhabited. I had been living at a distance from myself, making decisions from habit instead of truth, reacting from old patterns instead of present awareness. And the longer I stayed there, the harder it became to remember what I actually wanted. Not what made sense, not what looked reasonable, but what felt aligned. Alignment is a word we don't talk about much. It's quieter than happiness, less dramatic than purpose. But when it's missing, the soul notices. Alignment is the feeling that your inner life and outer life are in conversation with each other, that what you do reflects who you are, that you're not constantly translating yourself to fit the room. Without alignment, the soul goes underground. It becomes functional, but withdrawn. It does what it must to get you through the day, but it stops offering guidance. And that's when life begins to feel strangely directionless, not because there are no options, but because none of them feel personal. I wasn't lost in the world. I was lost inside my own experience of it. The soul is the place where meaning is made. And meaning doesn't come from productivity or approval. It comes from connection to self, to truth, to what feels real rather than what feels required. For years, I had postponed that connection. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just gradually. I told myself there would be time later to feel things through, to reflect, to listen inwardly. But the soul doesn't operate on someday. It lives in now. And when it's ignored long enough, it doesn't punish you, it withdraws. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. It stops offering depth because depth has nowhere to land. What I've come to understand is this. The soul doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be acknowledged. It wants honesty without urgency, presence without performance. It wants me to stop treating my inner life like an inconvenience. When I began to understand the soul this way, not as a problem to solve, but as a part of me that had been waiting, I felt something soften. Not relief, not joy, just recognition. And recognition is where healing actually begins. Not with answers, not with strategies, but with the quiet courage to say, this is what it feels like to be me right now. That's not weakness. That's truth. And the soul responds to truth the way a body responds to breath. Slowly, gently, without force. This is what I mean when I say soul. The pit I never talk about. There is a place I don't talk about. Not because it's dramatic or shameful, but because it's subtle enough to hide in plain sight. It doesn't look like despair. It doesn't announce itself as pain. It blends seamlessly into a normal life. I don't even call it a pit when I'm inside it. I call it being tired or needing space or just having a lot on my mind. But it is a pit It's where I go when I've done everything right for the day and still feel vaguely unsettled. When the house is quiet, the responsibilities are handled, and there's no immediate reason to feel anything at all. That's usually when it opens, not suddenly, not forcefully, but like a familiar room I drift into without thinking. The pit doesn't feel dark. That's what makes it dangerous. It feels muted, emotionally padded. Nothing hurts sharply there, but nothing really reaches me either. I slip into it late at night, when I'm scrolling without interest, my thumb moving out of habit more than curiosity. I tell myself I'm relaxing, but I'm not resting. I'm numbing. I let other people's lives flicker past me because it's easier than sitting with my own thoughts when they don't seem to go anywhere. Sometimes it shows up in long showers, where I stand still longer than necessary, letting the water run because motion feels safer than stillness. Sometimes it's zoning out during conversations, smiling and responding on cue while part of me quietly disconnects. The pit is not sadness. Sadness would be easier to explain. The pit is emotional low voltage. I don't feel devastated. I don't feel hopeful. I feel flat. Like the emotional range of my life has been compressed into something manageable and small, safe, predictable. At some point, without consciously deciding, I learned how to lower my expectations, not just of people, but of life itself. I stopped hoping for moments that felt expansive. I stopped expecting to be surprised by joy. I told myself this was realism, maturity, wisdom earned through experience. But realism can quietly turn into resignation. What makes the pit so convincing is that it doesn't interrupt my functioning. I still show up. I still do what's required of me. I still meet obligations and maintain relationships. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. And because nothing appears wrong, no one questions it, including me. The pit doesn't come from one big wound. It's built from a series of small accommodations. Each time I swallowed a reaction to keep the peace. Each time I chose being agreeable over being honest. Each time I told myself, it's not worth it, and let something go quiet inside me. Over time, those choices accumulate, not into anger or grief, but into distance from my feelings, from my desires, from the parts of myself that once responded quickly and fully to life. I didn't fall into the pit, I eased into it. That's an important distinction, because falling implies force. Easing implies adaptation. I adapted to disappointment by expecting less. I adapted to complexity by simplifying myself. I adapted to uncertainty by staying emotionally low risk. And the pit welcomed me because it required nothing. No courage, no vulnerability, no explanation. It let me stay intact on the surface while slowly withdrawing underneath. There's a strange comfort in that. When you've spent years managing yourself carefully, the pit feels like relief. No emotional demands, no internal conflict. Just a quiet, contained version of life where nothing really goes wrong, but nothing truly arrives either. The problem is, comfort and aliveness are not the same thing. I didn't notice how long I'd been there until I realized how automatic my days had become. How little I questioned my own reactions. How rarely I asked myself what I actually felt, rather than what made sense. I noticed it when even good things didn't land. Compliments felt distant. Achievements felt procedural. Moments that should have stirred something in me passed by with only a polite acknowledgement. I told myself I was being grateful. I told myself I was being grounded. But underneath that language was a quiet disengagement I didn't know how to name. The pit thrives on familiarity. It doesn't want to be challenged. It doesn't want to be exposed. It convinces you that staying is reasonable. It says, why risk disappointment? Why stir things up? Why want more when this is working? And because the pit doesn't hurt sharply, it's easy to mistake it for peace. But peace has presence. The pit has absence. I wasn't grieving anything specific. I wasn't angry at anyone in particular. I just felt absent from my own experience. Like I was watching my life through glass close enough to see, too far away to touch. What made it harder was that I had no language for this place. There's no socially accepted way to say, I'm not unhappy, but I'm not really here either. So I said nothing. I kept going. The pit doesn't isolate you from people. It isolates you from yourself. And when you're disconnected from yourself, everything else becomes transactional. Conversations are polite. Relationships are maintained. Decisions are made based on logic and precedent, not inner clarity. I wasn't living in pain. I was living in emotional standby. At some point, I realized I had stopped expecting my inner life to surprise me. I didn't anticipate insight or joy or even sorrow. I expected neutrality, and neutrality felt safer than risk. But safety has a cost. The cost is depth. The pit asks very little of you, but it takes more than you realize. It takes your curiosity, your responsiveness, your sense of inner movement. And because it takes those things slowly, you don't notice their absence until you start to wonder why everything feels slightly out of reach. The most unsettling part wasn't that I was in the pit. It was that I had started to identify with it. I told myself this was just who I was now, calmer, less reactive, more contained. But containment is not the same as wholeness. Wholeness allows for range, for response, for the freedom to feel without immediately managing the feeling. In the pit, everything is managed before it's felt. I didn't want to admit that I was staying there, because staying implies choice, and choice implies responsibility. It was easier to believe this was just the natural outcome of experience, that this flattening was inevitable. But something in me resisted that conclusion, not loudly, just enough to keep a question alive. Is this really the fullest version of being alive I'm willing to accept? That question didn't pull me out of the pit. Not yet. But it disrupted the comfort. It made the space feel less permanent. And once the pit loses its sense of inevitability, it can no longer convince you it's home. I wasn't ready to climb out. I wasn't even sure what out would look like. But I was no longer fully asleep in that place. I had begun to notice it, and noticing is the beginning of leaving. The pit didn't vanish. It didn't collapse. It simply became visible. And visibility changes everything. Because once you see where you are, you can no longer pretend you arrived there by accident. The moment I realized I was staying didn't arrive with drama. There was no breakdown, no decisive turning point that announced itself as change. It came quietly, almost politely, the way truth often does when it knows you won't listen if it raises its voice. I had told myself for a long time that I was just passing through this phase, that life would eventually open up again. That clarity would come when circumstances shifted, when the timing was right, when something external gave me permission to feel differently. I believed I was waiting. What I didn't want to admit was that waiting had slowly turned into settling. The realization didn't feel like guilt. It felt like recognition, the kind that settles into your body before your mind has a chance to argue with it. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't stuck because of what had happened to me. I was staying because staying had become familiar. And familiarity had begun to masquerade as safety. I remember sitting across from a woman I barely knew, sharing a table at a small cafe near downtown Boston. It wasn't a therapy session. It wasn't a confessional moment. Just two women talking honestly because there was nothing to lose. I spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable. I explained my life in a way that made sense. I offered context, history, justification. She listened without interrupting, without nodding too much, without trying to soften anything. And when I finished, she said something that landed with more precision than comfort. "That explains a lot," she said. "But it doesn't have to define what comes next." She didn't say it as advice. She said it as fact. I felt something shift inside me, not resistance, not defensiveness, but a kind of quiet exposure, because she was right. And I had known it long before she named it. I had just never allowed the thought to fully form. What happened to me explained the shape of my life. It explained my caution, my restraint, my emotional economy. But explanation had slowly turned into permission. Permission to remain exactly where I was, indefinitely. I had been treating my past like a permanent exemption from growth. That realization was uncomfortable, not because it blamed me, but because it returned agency to me. And agency is heavier than victimhood. Victimhood explains everything. Agency asks something of you. I had been telling myself that healing would begin when I felt ready, when I felt hopeful enough, rested enough, certain enough. I believed readiness was a feeling that would arrive one day and make movement possible. What I hadn't considered was that readiness might be a decision, not a sensation. Staying had been easy to justify. I had reasons, good ones, real ones. Reasons rooted in experience, loss, adaptation. But reasons, no matter how valid, don't automatically become truth about the future. They only explain the past. Somewhere along the way, I had confused understanding myself with committing to myself. Understanding didn't require action. Commitment did. I wasn't afraid of failure. I was afraid of responsibility. Because responsibility meant I could no longer say, "This is just how things are." It meant I would have to admit that part of my life was unfolding by default, not by intention. That was hard to face. It's easier to believe we're waiting for circumstances than to admit we're avoiding risk. Easier to believe we're being patient than to admit we're postponing. Easier to believe we're being realistic than to admit we've lowered the ceiling on our own lives. I didn't want to label myself as someone who had chosen limitation. I preferred to believe limitation had been imposed. But the truth was more complex and more hopeful than that. Yes, things had happened to me. Yes, they shaped me. Yes, they left marks. But they were no longer actively holding me in place. I was doing that myself, quietly, by refusing to imagine anything beyond what felt manageable. I had been waiting for certainty before moving. waiting to feel confident before choosing, waiting for fear to subside before acting. What I didn't want to acknowledge was that fear wasn't going anywhere. It had become part of my internal landscape. Waiting for it to disappear was like waiting for the weather to permanently stabilize. The moment I realized I was staying, I also realized something else. Nothing external was going to interrupt this pattern for me. No one was coming to pull me out. No event was going to force clarity. If my life was going to change, it would have to be because I chose to engage it differently. That wasn't empowering in a dramatic way. It was sobering. There was no surge of motivation, no sudden sense of purpose, just a quiet understanding that neutrality had been a choice and that it was costing me more than discomfort ever had. I wasn't living badly. But I wasn't living deliberately either. I had built a life that functioned smoothly, but I hadn't asked whether it still reflected who I was becoming. I had honored past versions of myself faithfully, but I hadn't checked in with the present one. Responsibility, I learned, isn't about blame. It's about authorship, and I had stopped authoring my own life. I had been letting habit decide for me, letting precedent carry more weight than desire, letting what made sense override what felt true. And over time, those choices had narrowed my inner world until it felt predictable, contained, and quietly unsatisfying. The hardest part was admitting that nothing was forcing me to stay small anymore. I had outgrown the conditions that once required it, but I was still living as if they were in place. That realization brought grief with it. Not grief for what I had lost, but grief for how long I had postponed myself. I had spent years being patient with everyone else's timelines, understanding everyone else's limitations, accommodating everyone else's pace. But I had offered myself very little of that generosity. Instead, I had told myself to wait until I felt ready, and readiness had become a moving target. What finally shifted wasn't courage, it was honesty. I stopped asking, "Why am I like this?" and started asking, "What am I choosing now?" That question didn't accuse me, it clarified me. It made it impossible to keep hiding behind explanations that no longer applied. It gently but firmly brought me into the present, where choice lives. I didn't suddenly know what to do next. I didn't have a plan. I didn't feel brave. I just knew that staying passive was no longer neutral. It was a decision with consequences. And once I saw that clearly, the pit lost some of its authority. It didn't disappear. It didn't release me willingly, but it no longer felt inevitable. I had crossed a line internally from being someone to whom life happened to someone who had a role in shaping it again. That line is subtle, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Because from that moment on, even hesitation carried awareness. Even fear existed alongside responsibility. And that meant I was no longer entirely asleep inside my own life. Healing didn't start there. Movement didn't even start there. But truth did. And once truth enters the room, nothing stays exactly the same again. Love I didn't have to earn. I didn't realize how transactional my understanding of love had become until I encountered a kind of love that asked nothing of me. Not improvement, not explanation, not effort, just presence. For most of my life, love had been something I earned by being useful, agreeable, competent, or quiet. I learned early how to read a room and adjust myself accordingly. I learned which versions of me were welcomed and which ones caused tension. Over time, those lessons hardened into instinct. I didn't question it. It felt normal. Love, as I understood it, came with conditions even when no one stated them outright. Be reasonable. Be kind. Be strong. Don't need too much. Don't complicate things. Don't ask questions that don't have clean answers. I became very good at this. I showed up prepared. I anticipated needs. I filled gaps before they became visible. I stayed one step ahead of disappointment by never expecting too much in return. And when relationships worked smoothly, I told myself that meant I was doing something right. But something subtle was happening beneath that competence. My sense of worth was being quietly outsourced to performance. And the better I performed, the less room there was to simply be. I didn't think of this as a problem. I thought of it as adulthood. Then, without warning, I found myself face to face with a kind of love that didn't respond to my strategies. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive in a moment of crisis. It came in an ordinary way on an ordinary afternoon when nothing in particular was wrong. I remember sitting alone on a bench in a quiet park in Denver. The sky was pale, the air cool enough to notice. I had gone there not because I needed answers, but because I needed to be somewhere that didn't ask anything of me. I wasn't praying. I wasn't reflecting deeply. I was just sitting. And that's when it happened, not as a feeling, but as an awareness. I didn't need to do anything to justify my presence. That thought felt unfamiliar enough to stop me cold. I realized how rarely I allowed myself to exist without an internal checklist. How often I measured my value by productivity, by emotional regulation, by how well I held everything together. Even in moments of rest, I was subtly evaluating myself. Was I resting correctly? Was I being grateful enough? Was I wasting time? Love, in my internal world, always had an audience, and suddenly here was someone that didn't require a performance. I didn't feel overwhelmed with joy. I didn't feel emotional release. What I felt was discomfort. Unconditional acceptance is deeply unsettling when you've built your identity around earning your place. When nothing is required of you, you're forced to confront who you are without your strategies. And that can feel frightening, because strategies protect us. They give us control. They allow us to manage outcomes. Love that doesn't need to be earned removes that control. I noticed how quickly I tried to reassert it, how my mind searched for ways to be deserving, how I instinctively wanted to improve myself before fully receiving what was already being offered. But this love didn't respond to improvement plans. It didn't wait for me to become more healed, more insightful, more put together. It met me exactly where I was and stayed there. I didn't trust it at first. I had learned to associate love with evaluation. Even kindness felt conditional. If things were going well, love felt accessible. If I struggled, love felt distant. Over time, I internalized that pattern. I believed I had to maintain a certain version of myself to remain acceptable. What I encountered instead was a love that remained steady regardless of my internal state. That steadiness was what undid me, because steadiness doesn't negotiate, it doesn't bargain, it doesn't reward effort or withdraw when you fail. It simply is. I began to realize how exhausted I was from constantly managing myself to be lovable, from editing my thoughts before expressing them, from minimizing my needs so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. from believing that if I could just stay composed, everything would stay intact. But composure is not connection, and control is not safety. Love that doesn't need to be earned exposes how much energy we spend trying to secure it. It reveals how deeply we believe we are only as valuable as our usefulness. And it challenges that belief not with argument, but with presence. I didn't become more confident in that moment. I became quieter in the sense that something inside me stopped bracing, stopped anticipating withdrawal, stopped preparing for disappointment. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't scanning for cues. I wasn't monitoring reactions. I wasn't adjusting myself mid-thought. I was simply there. That kind of love doesn't make you feel powerful. It makes you feel seen. And being seen, truly seen, can feel almost unbearable when you've spent years hiding behind competence. Because when there's nothing to earn, there's nothing to hide behind either. I had to face parts of myself I had kept tucked away not because they were shameful, but because they were tender. Parts that didn't know how to function without performing. Parts that were unsure who they were without roles to play. I realized then that much of my exhaustion didn't come from doing too much. It came from being someone other than myself for too long. Love that is freely given invites you back into yourself. It doesn't demand change, but it makes change possible by removing fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of being known. I had always believed that being accepted as is would make me complacent, that without pressure I would stagnate. But what I found was the opposite. Acceptance didn't make me smaller. It gave me room. Room to notice my own inner landscape without immediately trying to fix it. Room to acknowledge fatigue without justifying it. Room to rest without feeling irresponsible. This love didn't flatter me. It didn't inflate my sense of self. It grounded me. It allowed me to feel human again, not an optimized version of myself, not a curated one, but a real one. I didn't feel better overnight. I felt more honest. And honesty, I've learned, is far more transformative than motivation. When you stop earning love, you stop performing healing. You stop rushing your own process. You stop trying to become someone else in order to deserve peace. I began to understand that love wasn't meant to be the reward for getting things right. It was meant to be the ground beneath my feet while I learned how to live truthfully. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came with a quiet release, the kind that happens when you finally set down something heavy you didn't realize you were carrying. I didn't need to become better to be loved. I needed to stop believing I was unlovable unless I did. That shift changed how I related to everything, to rest, to mistakes, to my own inner voice. It softened the constant internal negotiation I'd been living with. For the first time, love wasn't something I chased. It was something I allowed. And allowing, I discovered, is one of the hardest and bravest things a woman can do when she's been surviving for a long time. Because survival teaches you how to earn safety. Love teaches you how to receive it. I didn't suddenly trust everything. I didn't suddenly trust myself. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer living under the assumption that I had to prove my worth before I could be at peace. I could rest first. I could be honest first. I could be present first. Not because I had achieved anything, but because I was already held. That kind of love doesn't rush you forward. It meets you where you are and stays long enough for you to recognize yourself again. Forgiveness without romanticizing pain. Forgiveness was never something I romanticized. I didn't imagine it as a soft moment, a clean release, or a spiritual achievement. If anything, I resisted it. Not because I wanted to stay angry, but because forgiveness had always been presented to me as something that required erasing the truth. And I wasn't willing to do that. I wasn't willing to pretend that what happened didn't matter. I wasn't willing to rewrite history so it hurt less. I wasn't willing to minimize the impact of words, absences, or choices that shaped the way I learned to protect myself. For a long time, forgiveness felt like betrayal of my own experience, of the woman I had been when I didn't yet know how to defend herself. I feared that forgiving would mean excusing. That letting go would mean saying it was acceptable. It wasn't. What I had to learn slowly, reluctantly, was that forgiveness had nothing to do with approval. It had everything to do with release. I didn't arrive at that understanding willingly. I arrived at it because carrying resentment had begun to cost me more than the original harm ever did. Resentment is heavy, but it's also strangely familiar. It gives shape to pain. It gives you something to hold on to when accountability never came. It keeps the story intact when no one else acknowledged it. For a while, resentment felt like proof that what I experienced was real. But over time, it began to harden into something else, something quieter but more corrosive. I noticed it in how easily my body tensed, in how quickly I assumed the worst, in how often my mind returned to old scenes, not to resolve them, but to relive them. I wasn't processing the past. I was preserving it. I told myself this vigilance was wisdom, that staying alert was protection. But protection that never relaxes eventually becomes a prison. I wasn't living in the past emotionally because I wanted to. I was living there because I didn't know how to leave without denying myself. Forgiveness didn't start as a decision. It started as exhaustion. I grew tired of carrying people who no longer showed up in my life, tired of rehearsing conversations that would never happen, tired of waiting for understanding that wasn't coming. I realized I was still emotionally negotiating with ghosts. That's when something shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. I understood that forgiveness wasn't about what they deserved, it was about what I needed in order to live freely. I didn't need them to change. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to understand. I needed my inner life back. Forgiveness, as I came to understand it, was not a feeling, it was a boundary. It was the decision to stop giving mental and emotional real estate to people who no longer had access to my present. It was the choice to end internal conversations that only reopened wounds without offering clarity. I didn't forgive because I felt compassionate. I forgave because I wanted peace that didn't depend on someone else's awareness. That distinction mattered. I also had to confront the version of forgiveness I had avoided the longest, forgiving myself. Not in a shallow way, not by saying I did my best and moving on, but by honestly acknowledging the ways I had adapted in order to survive and the ways those adaptations had outlived their usefulness. I had to forgive myself for staying quiet when speaking felt unsafe, for choosing containment over expression, for becoming someone smaller in order to remain intact. Those choices weren't failures, they were strategies. And strategies aren't meant to be permanent identities, but I had been judging myself as if they were. Self-forgiveness required me to stop holding my past self to standards she couldn't have met with the resources she had. It required compassion without condescension, accountability without cruelty. That was harder than forgiving anyone else. I was used to understanding others. I was not used to extending that same understanding inward. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in small decisions. In moments when I noticed my mind drifting back to familiar anger and gently redirected it, not with force, but with awareness. I stopped telling the same stories with the same emotional charge, not because they weren't true, but because they no longer needed repetition to validate them. I stopped using pain as proof. That didn't mean the memories disappeared. It meant they lost their grip. They became part of my history instead of my identity. One of the most surprising things I discovered was that forgiveness didn't make me softer in the way I feared. It made me clearer, less reactive, more grounded. Letting go of resentment didn't erase my boundaries, it strengthened them. I no longer needed anger to remind me of what I would not tolerate. I could remember without reliving. I could acknowledge without reopening. Forgiveness didn't make me forget. It made me free. There were days when I felt like nothing had changed, when the old thoughts returned, uninvited, when resentment crept back in under the guise of self-protection. I learned not to panic when that happened. Forgiveness isn't a one-time act. It's a posture, a willingness to choose release again and again, especially when old patterns offer familiarity. Each time I chose not to engage, something loosened. Each time I chose presence over rumination, something softened. What surprised me most was how forgiveness changed my relationship with time. The past stopped feeling immediate. The present felt more spacious. The future stopped feeling like something I needed to defend myself against. I wasn't naive. I didn't suddenly trust everyone. I didn't open myself indiscriminately. Forgiveness didn't erase discernment. It refined it. I became less interested in being right and more interested in being at peace. Less invested in proving harm and more committed to not carrying it forward. I stopped romanticizing pain as something noble or formative. Pain had shaped me, yes, but it didn't need to be honored forever. Healing didn't require me to keep the wound open. Forgiveness allowed me to close the chapter without pretending it was a good story, without rewriting it as something it wasn't, without demanding meaning where there was only harm. I didn't need a lesson. I needed closure. And closure, I learned, doesn't come from others. It comes from the moment you decide that your inner life deserves relief. Forgiveness wasn't about becoming a better person. It was about becoming less burdened. It didn't make me virtuous. It made me lighter. And in that lightness, I found something unexpected, not joy, not resolution, but space. Space to breathe without bracing. Space to move forward without dragging the past behind me. Space to live without constantly protecting myself from memories that no longer had authority. I didn't forgive because I was healed. I forgave because I was ready to heal. And healing, I learned, doesn't ask you to forget what happened. It asks you to stop living there, living without the old weight. Living without the old weight didn't feel like a breakthrough. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no dramatic shift that announced itself as healing. If anything, the change was so quiet I almost missed it. What disappeared first wasn't pain, it was urgency. For most of my life, something inside me had always been braced. Even on good days, even in calm moments, there was a low-level tension humming beneath the surface, an alertness that never fully turned off. I didn't know it was there until it wasn't. The absence of that tension felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I remember waking up one morning and realizing I wasn't already tired, not physically, emotionally. My body still had its aches. My responsibilities were still waiting, but there was no sense of being internally chased. No pressure to catch up with myself, just a steady, quiet awareness of being present. That was new. Healing didn't make my life louder or more exciting. It made it more stable. And stability, I learned, is deeply underrated. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't impress, but it holds you. I stopped reacting so quickly, not because I was suppressing anything, but because I no longer needed to defend myself from every sensation. Feelings could rise and fall without demanding immediate interpretation. Thoughts could pass through without being interrogated. I didn't feel numb anymore, but I also didn't feel overwhelmed. There was space between stimulus and response, space where I could choose instead of reflexively protect, space where I could notice what was happening inside me before deciding what to do with it. That space changed everything. I had spent years living as if every interaction required management, tone, timing, wording, everything mattered because everything felt consequential. But without the old weight, not everything felt like a test anymore. Some conversations no longer required preparation. Some silences no longer felt threatening. Some misunderstandings no longer felt personal. I didn't become indifferent. I became grounded. Grounded enough to let moments pass without extracting meaning from them. Grounded enough to stay with discomfort without immediately trying to resolve it. Grounded enough to trust that not every feeling needed a conclusion. One of the most unexpected shifts was how my body responded. I breathed more deeply without trying. My shoulders didn't rise as quickly. I slept more soundly, not because my life had become easier, but because my nervous system wasn't constantly scanning for danger. The old weight had lived in my body as much as my mind. It had taught me to stay alert, to anticipate, to prepare for disappointment, even when nothing was wrong. Letting it go felt like learning a new posture, less rigid, less guarded. People around me noticed before I did. "You seem lighter," someone said once, casually, without knowing how precisely accurate that observation was. I didn't feel lighter in a dramatic sense. I felt less burdened by myself. I wasn't carrying so many internal narratives anymore. I didn't need to explain myself constantly to others or to my own thoughts. I trusted my internal experience enough to let it exist without justification. That trust was hard-won. Living without the old weight didn't mean I stopped feeling pain. It meant pain no longer defined the boundaries of my life. Disappointment still came, sadness still surfaced, but they moved through me instead of settling in. I stopped asking, "What does this say about me?" and started asking, "What is this asking of me right now?" Sometimes the answer was rest. Sometimes it was honesty. Sometimes it was simply patience. I didn't need to perform resilience anymore. I didn't need to prove how far I'd come or how strong I was. Strength had become quieter, more internal, less concerned with being seen. I also noticed how my relationship with time changed. I no longer felt like I was behind. I no longer felt pressured to catch up with some invisible version of myself I thought I should have become by now. I was where I was, and that was enough. That sense of enoughness didn't come from achievement. It came from alignment, from the growing sense that my inner life and outer life were no longer at odds with each other. I made decisions more slowly, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I allowed myself to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. I trusted that clarity would arrive when it was ready, not when I demanded it. Living without the old weight also changed how I related to others. I listened differently, not to fix or manage, but to understand. I spoke more honestly, not to provoke, but to be accurate. I noticed when something didn't feel right sooner, and I honored that awareness instead of talking myself out of it. I didn't override my intuition for the sake of comfort or convenience. Boundaries became less about defense and more about care. Care for my energy, care for my time, care for the life I was still becoming. There was a humility in this stage of healing that surprised me. I wasn't interested in reinvention. I wasn't trying to become someone new. I was reclaiming parts of myself that had been set aside for too long. That process wasn't glamorous. It was quiet and repetitive. It involved small choices made consistently, often without witnesses. Choosing not to over-explain. Choosing not to stay where I felt diminished. Choosing rest without apology. Choosing honesty without drama. The old weight had convinced me that life required constant vigilance. Living without it showed me that life could also be met with steadiness, not optimism, not blind trust, steadiness. I didn't feel euphoric. I felt rooted in my body, rooted in my experience, rooted in a sense of self that didn't need constant reinforcement. There were days when the old habits tried to return, when my mind reached for familiar patterns of control or self-protection. I didn't panic when that happened. I recognized it as residue, not failure. Healing isn't linear. It's cumulative. Each time I chose presence over avoidance, the ground beneath me felt more solid. Each time I responded, instead of reacted, I trusted myself a little more. I didn't become fearless. I became less governed by fear. That distinction matters. Fear still visited, but it no longer dictated my movements. It was information, not instruction. Living without the old weight didn't make my life extraordinary. It made it inhabitable. I could be inside my own experience without constantly negotiating with it. I could feel deeply without drowning. I could engage with the world without losing myself in it. That, to me, was freedom. Not the freedom to do anything, but the freedom to be present wherever I was. And presence, I discovered, carries its own quiet joy. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that settles in your chest and stays. I wasn't chasing happiness anymore. I was living with steadiness. And that steadiness held me in ways intensity never had. You are not broken. I want to end where so many women secretly begin, with the quiet suspicion that something inside them must be broken. Not damaged in an obvious way, not shattered beyond repair, just off, misaligned, like a machine that still runs, but no longer runs smoothly. Like a life that looks intact, but feels strangely disconnected from the person living it. For a long time, I believed that if I felt this way, it meant something had gone wrong inside me, that I had missed a step, that I hadn't healed correctly, matured properly, or grown the way I was supposed to. I assumed this sense of dislocation was evidence of failure. It took me years to understand how wrong that assumption was. I am not broken. What I am, what so many women like me are, is in the middle. The middle is not a place we talk about often. It doesn't have the clarity of beginnings or the resolution of endings. It doesn't come with dramatic language or clear milestones. There's no ceremony for it, no applause, no obvious marker that says, "You are here now." The middle is where the old ways no longer fit, but the new ones haven't fully formed yet. It's where the identities that once carried you start to feel tight, and the future hasn't yet offered you something solid to step into. It's where you realize that survival is no longer the goal, but you're not quite sure what replaces it. The middle can feel like confusion, like restlessness, like grief without an object. It can feel like boredom, dissatisfaction, or a vague sense that life is happening slightly out of sync with who you are becoming. And because the middle doesn't look like a crisis, we tend to pathologize it. We assume it means we're ungrateful, unmotivated, or failing to appreciate what we have. We tell ourselves to push through, to be patient, to stop overthinking. But the middle is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. I didn't arrive here because I did something wrong. I arrived here because I lived, because I adapted, because I learned, because the woman I was had served her purpose, and the woman I am becoming needed space. The middle is where honesty becomes unavoidable. It's where the strategies that once kept you safe stop working, where the roles you played no longer bring satisfaction, where the expectations you met no longer feel like they belong to you. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you evolved. For a long time, I resisted this stage because it felt like stagnation. I wanted movement, direction, certainty. I wanted to know what came next so I could prepare for it, optimize for it, control it. But the middle doesn't respond to control. It asks for something else entirely. It asks for patience, not the passive kind, but the attentive kind. The kind that listens instead of rushing. The kind that notices subtle shifts instead of demanding clarity. The kind that trusts that becoming doesn't follow a straight line. I had to learn to stop interpreting uncertainty as danger, to stop reading discomfort as failure, to stop assuming that not knowing meant I was lost. Not knowing, I discovered, often means you're listening. The middle is where you begin to hear yourself again, not the voice shaped by obligation or expectation, but the quieter one underneath. The one that speaks in hesitations and intuitions rather than declarations. The one that doesn't shout, but persists. I used to think healing would feel like closure, like resolution, like arriving somewhere solid and recognizable. What it felt like instead was openness. An openness that made room for contradictions, for tenderness, for questions that didn't need immediate answers, for a life that could be lived without constant evaluation. I stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "What is changing?" That shift mattered, because brokenness implies something needs to be fixed. The middle implies something is unfolding, and unfolding takes time. I didn't need to reinvent myself. I didn't need to become someone new. I needed to stop forcing myself to remain someone I had already outgrown. The middle is uncomfortable because it requires us to release identities that once gave us certainty. It asks us to loosen our grip on narratives that explained our past but limit our future. It invites us into a kind of humility that says, I don't have to know who I am forever. I just have to be honest about who I am right now. That kind of honesty can feel destabilizing. But it is also deeply grounding. I learned that the middle doesn't demand urgency. It doesn't reward speed. It doesn't respond well to pressure. It unfolds at its own pace, often slower than we'd like, but always with intention. There were days when I wanted to skip ahead, to fast forward to clarity, to arrive at a version of myself that felt finished, resolved, confident. But every time I tried to rush the process, I felt more disconnected. So I stopped rushing. I allowed myself to live without answers, to let questions remain open, to trust that meaning would reveal itself gradually through experience rather than effort. That trust didn't make me passive. It made me present. Presence, I learned, is what the middle requires most. Not plans, not predictions, presence. Being here, feeling what is real, listening without immediately acting. The middle is where integration happens, where the pieces of your life, past, present, possibility, begin to speak to each other, where you stop compartmentalizing and start inhabiting yourself more fully. I didn't become happier in a dramatic sense. I became more whole. Wholeness isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as coherence, as the sense that your inner life and outer life are no longer at odds, as the relief of not having to perform certainty when you don't feel it. I stopped measuring my progress by how far I'd come or how much I'd achieved. I measured it by how honestly I could live with myself. Could I sit with discomfort without fleeing? Could I say no without guilt? Could I rest without justifying it? Could I trust my own timing? Those became the markers that mattered. The middle taught me that I don't need to be fixed to be worthy of a full life. I don't need to arrive anywhere to begin living differently. I don't need to resolve every question before taking the next small step. I am allowed to be unfinished. I am allowed to be in transition. I'm allowed to live in the in-between without apologizing for it. If you are listening to this and recognizing yourself, if you feel functional but unfulfilled, steady but strangely absent, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not failing at life. You are in the middle. And the middle is not a mistake. It is a passage. A passage that asks for gentleness instead of judgment, curiosity instead of correction, trust instead of force. You don't need to push your way out of it. You don't need to solve it. You need to inhabit it. Because the middle is where the next version of you is quietly taking shape, not through effort, but through attention. And one day, without drama, you will look back and realize that this uncertain, uncomfortable, honest place was not an interruption to your life. It was the place where you finally began to live it from the inside out. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. And that is not something to escape. It is something to honor.